Have you ever felt like your intelligence was being used against you? Like the very thing that made you observant, analytical, perceptive was slowly turning into a trap. You read between the lines. You see through the noise. You calculate 5 moves ahead. And somehow, you still find yourself drained, distracted, and quietly disappointed. Not because you missed the signs, but because you kept reacting to them. You kept trying to fix, to clarify, to prove. You thought, if I just understand more, I'll be safe. If I explain myself better, I'll be respected. If I'm always available, I'll be valued. But here's the quiet truth no one told you. Being intelligent doesn't make you immune to mental traps. It just makes the traps more sophisticated. Because smart people don't fall for the obvious. They fall for what feels noble. The urgency that disguises itself as responsibility. The overthinking that pretends to be depth. The silent contracts you never agreed to, but keep honoring anyway. You don't get manipulated with force. You get lured with precision, with praise, with expectation, with roles you never auditioned for. And before you realize it, your mind isn't yours anymore. It's a battlefield of invisible demands. But that ends here. This isn't a video about being smarter. It's about seeing sharper, choosing quieter, walking away, not out of defeat, but out of mastery. Because the wisest people I know aren't loud. They don't explain their boundaries. They don't broadcast their clarity. They just exit calmly, without noise, without guilt. In this video, we'll uncover 10 psychological traps intelligent people learn to escape, not by fighting, not by fixing, but by remembering your power isn't in how much you know, it's in what you no longer respond to. So take a breath, step back, and start seeing the game for what it is. Not as a player, but as someone who's finally choosing not to play. Not everything that demands your attention deserves your energy. But in today's world, everything is presented as if it does. The urgent emails, the blinking notifications, the messages marked ASAP. We live in a culture addicted to artificial urgency, a system built to hijack your nervous system and keep you in a constant state of reaction. And the more intelligent you are, the more likely you are to respond. Because you've been conditioned to think, if I'm smart, I must be useful. If I'm useful, I must be available. If I'm available, I must respond immediately. But what if that's the trap? What if urgency isn't a call to action, but a manipulation of your identity? Think about it. How many times have you stopped what you were doing, something important, something real, just to answer a ping that added no value to your life? How often do you rearrange your piece to accommodate someone else's poor planning, simply because they said it was urgent? Here's the truth most people miss. Urgency is often a form of power leakage. It creates a false crisis, gets you to abandon your rhythm, and rewards chaos with compliance. And every time you react without pause, you reinforce the loop. You become less sovereign, less still, less you. The Stoics saw this long before the age of notifications. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If you seek tranquility, do less, or do only what's essential, and do it with clarity." This isn't laziness, it's discipline. It's choosing intentionality over impulse. Because the intelligent person doesn't just ask, "What needs to be done?" They ask, "What deserves my presence?" I once worked with someone who mastered the art of frenzy. Every task was a fire. Every request was urgent. Every delay was personal. At first, I matched their tempo. I responded at midnight, canceled rest, answered before thinking. I thought I was being dependable, but over time I realized I wasn't more efficient. I was just more exhausted. I had turned their storm into my schedule. That's when I started asking myself one question before I reacted to anything. Is this truly urgent? Or is it just screaming the loudest? That pause changed everything. It gave me back the power of my own tempo. I began delaying, not to be rude, but to reclaim. I stopped rewarding panic with instant replies. I stopped mistaking pressure for purpose. Psychologically, the urgency trap is a dopamine loop. It makes you feel important, needed in motion. But motion without direction is noise, and intelligence without clarity is burnout in disguise. That's why intelligent people learn to escape the urgency scam, not by becoming slow, but by becoming still. Because once you realize that not every knock deserves an answer, you start hearing something deeper, your own rhythm, your own mind. And in that space, you stop reacting. You start choosing. Stillness, after all, isn't a delay. It's discernment. There's a quiet desperation that hides behind the need to prove yourself. And the more intelligent you are, the more subtle the performance becomes. It's not loud. It's not obvious. It's in the way you overexplain your decisions, the way you casually mention achievements in conversations that you didn't ask, the way you feel the need to justify your boundaries, hoping someone will validate your clarity. On the surface, it looks like confidence, but underneath, it's often something else, something hollow. Because when you constantly feel the urge to explain who you are, what you've done, and why you think the way you do, what you're really saying is, I don't fully believe it yet. This is one of the most invisible traps intelligent people fall into, the performance of intelligence. You see, smart minds grow up praised for being sharp, articulate, and insightful. Over time, praise becomes identity. Identity becomes expectation, and expectation becomes pressure. Now, you don't just want to be understood, you need to be. You don't just want to be right, you feel unsafe if you're misread. So you talk more, you justify deeper, you present your mind like a resume, hoping it will buy you acceptance. But here's the problem. The more you perform your intelligence, the more it becomes a product, something to be consumed, evaluated, judged. And that creates a quiet kind of exhaustion, one where you're always in a role, always rehearsing how to sound smart, look wise, feel respected. The Stoics offer a radical alternative. Epictetus said, if you wish to improve, be content to be thought foolish. Let that settle. Be content to be misunderstood, to not be explained, to not be praised, because your peace begins where your performance ends. I once knew someone who couldn't finish a sentence without citing credentials. He wasn't arrogant. He was afraid of being dismissed, afraid of being invisible. His intelligence had become his armor, and every time someone didn't affirm it, he felt like he was shrinking. But here's what intelligent people eventually realize. Real self-worth doesn't need an audience. Identity is not something you perform, it's something you embody, quietly, consistently, without spectacle. You don't need to convince people who already see you, and you don't need to perform for those who never will. Psychologically, this trap stems from early reinforcement, when being praised became synonymous with being safe. But over time, it creates a loop. The more you explain, the less you're believed. And the less you're believed, the more you explain. It's a performance with no standing ovation. So what do intelligent people do differently? They learn to be silent in moments that demand applause. They choose clarity over performance, presence over presentation. And when misunderstood, they don't chase correction, they let it pass. Not because they don't care, but because they know being seen clearly is a gift, not a requirement. Sometimes the smartest thing you can say is nothing. And that's not a weakness, that's self-respect. There's a kind of loyalty that looks like love, but is really just fear in disguise. It's the quiet habit of saying yes when your soul whispers no. It's the instinct to nod, agree, assist, accommodate, until you become a ghost in your own life. This is the third trap intelligent people often fall into. the silent contract of pleasing. You don't remember signing it. No one asked you to, but somehow you keep honoring it because somewhere along the way, your intelligence got tied to your usefulness. Your worth got measured by how little you needed and how much you gave. People-pleasing doesn't always come from weakness. Often it comes from over-awareness. You sense tension, you anticipate conflict, you read disappointment in someone's voice before they even say it, and instead of holding your boundary, you edit yourself. Not because you're dishonest, but because you've been conditioned to keep the peace. But what if keeping the peace is the very thing robbing you of it? You see, when you constantly prioritize other people's comfort over your own clarity, you create a subtle but dangerous pattern. You trade truth for harmony. You silence your needs to protect their expectations. And in doing so, you begin to disappear, not physically, but energetically. You become the agreeable one, the reliable one, the easy one, and eventually the invisible one. Seneca warned, "He who seeks to please others is rarely at peace with himself," because people-pleasing is not about kindness, it's about survival. It's a strategy you develop to feel safe, to avoid abandonment, to be needed. But intelligent people eventually realize, pleasing is not the same as connecting. Compliance is not compassion, and being agreeable is not the same as being authentic. I once knew someone who had a rule. She never said no to anyone, ever. She was generous, empathetic, and always available. But one day she looked at me and said, "I don't think people love me. I think they love the version of me I perform for them." That sentence never left me, because it revealed what most people never admit. When you live to please, you never feel seen. You only feel consumed. So how do intelligent people escape this trap? They begin by disappointing the right people, not out of rebellion, but out of reverence for themselves. They start saying, "No, thank you," calmly. "I'm not available for that," without apology. They speak with gentle clarity, not defensive explanation, because they know boundaries don't require volume, they require conviction. Psychologically, people-pleasing is a form of emotional debt. You keep giving, hoping one day they'll repay you with love, loyalty, or appreciation. But they rarely do, not because they're cruel, but because they never agreed to that contract. You created it, silently, without consent. That's why intelligent people don't just say yes less often. They stop offering themselves a discount. They stop proving their goodness through exhaustion. They realize being liked is not worth being lost. So they walk away from the silent contract. They choose clarity over comfort. And they understand, if your truth makes them uncomfortable, that's not your betrayal. That's their boundary being revealed. And sometimes the most loving thing you can say is, "This is where I end." Not to punish, but to return to yourself. There's a dangerous illusion that lives in the minds of many intelligent people. The belief that if they just gather enough knowledge, clarity will follow. So they read more, watch more, listen more. They hoard insights, collect perspectives, and memorize techniques. And still, they feel stuck, overloaded, scattered, not because they lack intelligence, but because they're trapped inside it. This is the fourth trap, knowledge addiction. On the surface, it looks noble, productive, enlightened. You're always learning, always growing. But if you're honest, it starts to feel like a treadmill. The more you know, the more uncertain you become. The more you consume, the less integrated you feel. Because not all knowledge nourishes. Some of it clutters, some of it distracts, some of it is just noise dressed as wisdom. We live in a time where information is endless, but insight is rare. And intelligent people, especially those who value self-improvement, fall into the trap of believing that knowing more is the same as becoming more. But there's a difference between learning to act and learning to avoid action, between preparing to live and avoiding life through preparation. The Stoics warned us about this. Seneca wrote, "What's the point of having countless books and no time to read them? It is not reading much, but reading wisely that yields benefit." In other words, depth over volume, integration over accumulation, stillness over stimulation. I once met a man who could quote every philosopher from Aurelius to Zizek. He could debate, dissect, and deliver brilliant insight on command. But when I asked him a simple question, "What's one thing you've actually changed about your life in the last year?" He paused, he blinked, and then quietly he said, "Nothing really." That's when I realized intelligence without integration becomes inertia. A brilliant mind with no action is just a library no one visits. This trap is subtle because it flatters your ego. You feel smart, you sound insightful, you're never bored. But beneath the surface, there's a fear that if you stop learning, you'll fall behind. That if you pause, you'll become irrelevant. That if you stop collecting knowledge, you'll lose your edge. But the truth is, most of your transformation won't come from what you know. It will come from what you do with what you already know. Psychologically, knowledge addiction is a form of emotional buffering. Instead of facing discomfort, we intellectualize it. We research the feeling instead of feeling it. We study the path instead of walking it. But intelligent people, those who've tasted burnout from too much information, begin to choose differently. They curate, they filter, they pause. They say no to noise, even if it sounds wise. They understand that peace doesn't come from reading another book. It comes from applying one idea, quietly, consistently, and without performance. They stop chasing insights to impress others, and they start returning to the ones that anchor them. Because wisdom isn't how much you know, it's how little you overthink what you already do. And sometimes the smartest step forward is to stop scrolling and start integrating. There's a peculiar kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from your own chaos, but from trying to fix everyone else's. The unspoken role of the wise one, the helper, the healer, the person people come to when their world starts unraveling. And at first it feels good, like purpose, like connection, like being needed. But over time, you begin to notice something. Your peace is shrinking. Your clarity is leaking. You've become a full-time firefighter in other people's emotional fires. And your own house slowly burning in silence. This is the fifth trap intelligent people often fall into: fixing others to avoid fixing themselves. It begins subtly. A friend vents and you offer a three-step solution. A partner spirals and you rush to regulate their emotions. A colleague panics and you steady their storm. You do it not out of arrogance, but out of instinct, because you've always been the one who sees things clearly, the one who understands before others even finish speaking. But insight without boundary is not compassion, it's compulsion. The truth is, many intelligent people carry a hidden fear that if they're not useful, they're disposable. So they offer advice like currency. They fix to be worthy. They heal to be held. But what they don't realize is, unasked advice is rarely about love. It's often about control. Control disguised as care. Helping becomes a strategy to manage discomfort, not theirs, but your own. The Stoics warned against this subtle ego trap. Epictetus said, "Nature gave us one tongue and two ears so that we may listen twice as much as we speak. But in urgency, we reverse the ratio. We jump in, we interrupt, we perform wisdom, and in doing so, we violate one of the most sacred things a person can give us, their silence." I once opened up to someone during a difficult season. I hadn't even finished my sentence before they gave me a 5-point plan. I didn't feel heard, I felt handled. And that's the wound most fixers don't realize they cause. They center themselves in someone else's pain. They overwrite someone's process with their performance. Psychologically, fixing others can be a form of emotional avoidance. It keeps the spotlight off your own work, your own wounds, your own patterns, Because if you're busy healing everyone else, you don't have to sit still long enough to face your own reflection. But intelligent people, especially those who've been burned by overextending, begin to do something radical. They stop assuming their clarity is required. They start asking instead, would you like me to listen or offer perspective? They stop inserting themselves into emotional spaces they haven't been invited into, and they learn to let silence breathe. Because not every crisis is yours to solve. Not every emotion is yours to regulate, and not every person is asking to be fixed. Some are just asking to be witnessed, gently, quietly, without interruption. So intelligent people withdraw from the performance of helping. They stop proving their worth through advice, and they realize, you don't have to fix someone to love them. You don't have to explain the path. They're already walking it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer is presence without prescription. That's not distance, that's respect. There's a silent form of self-betrayal that intelligent people rarely recognize until it's already cost them years of peace. It hides beneath loyalty. It speaks in phrases like, they've been there for me, or they just need time, or but we've been through so much. And while the logic sounds noble, the emotional truth is this. You're holding on to people who no longer hold you. This is the sixth trap, loyalty without discernment. It begins with good intentions. You believe in people, you see their potential, you forgive their inconsistency, and you keep showing up even when their presence feels like an emotional leak. Why? Because you think loyalty means endurance, that love means sacrifice, that being intelligent means being the bigger person. But here's the shift. Loyalty without clarity is a trap disguised as virtue. I once watched someone stay in a friendship that had quietly rotted. The conversations were shallow. The energy was one-sided. The jokes carried undertones of envy. And yet she stayed. Not because she was blind, but because she felt indebted, bound by time, by history, by shared moments. She didn't want to be the one who walked away. But here's the truth. Sometimes walking away is the most honest form of staying true to yourself. The Stoics taught that virtue isn't about tolerating everything. It's about choosing with wisdom. Seneca wrote, associate with those who will make a better man of you, not those who drain you, not those who praise you only to pacify their own insecurity, not those who demand access to your peace without offering presence in return. Psychologically, undisciplined loyalty often stems from emotional contracts written in childhood. The belief that love must be earned, that leaving is betrayal, that distance equals failure. But intelligent people who've been emotionally overdrawn begin to recalibrate. They notice the imbalance. The passive aggression is masked as humor. The patterns of being available only when convenient. And instead of confronting it with drama, they do something more powerful. They stop renewing access. They don't explode. They don't over-explain. They simply begin to fade. Not out of resentment, but out of realization that not everyone who was part of your story belongs in your next chapter. They learn that you can appreciate the history without extending the future. You can love someone without lending them your energy. You can honor what was and still choose what's needed now. Because loyalty without discernment is how intelligent people become trapped in expired roles. They become the emotional caretaker, the unpaid therapist, the audience to someone else's drama. But once they reclaim their clarity, something shifts. They stop chasing potential and start honoring consistency. They stop explaining why they've changed and start embodying the change itself. And when the guilt whispers, but you owe them, they gently reply, I owed myself first. That's not disloyalty. That's discernment. It's not cutting people off. It's cutting the thread that kept you small. Some traps don't look like cages. They sound like declarations. I've always been like this. That's just who I am. I don't change for anyone. And while these sentences may feel like confidence, they're often something else entirely: resignation. This is the seventh trap intelligent people learn to escape, the trap of the self-narrative. At first, it feels like identity. You know yourself. You've done the work. You've labeled the pattern. But then you start living inside the label. I'm the strong one. I overthink everything. I'm bad at relationships. These aren't observations, they're predictions, scripts, invisible contracts you keep signing every time you say them out loud. And the smarter you are, the more sophisticated these scripts become. You rationalize them, you wrap them in insight, you defend them with logic, but beneath it all, you're not protecting your truth. You're protecting your familiarity. I once spoke to someone who described herself as emotionally unavailable, but self-aware. She wore it like armor, like a badge, as if awareness alone granted her immunity from growth. But what she didn't see was this: self-awareness without self-interruption becomes a prison. Because the moment you say, "This is just who I am," you stop asking the better question, "Who am I becoming?" Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." That's not just poetic, it's practical. It means your repeated stories, even the quiet ones, shape your behavior, your choices, your future. And if those stories are outdated, borrowed, or rooted in past pain, so is the life you're unconsciously building. Psychologically, self-narrative traps are cozy. They feel like control, even painful ones. I always sabotage good things. I'm too intense. I attract chaos. These lines become a shield, keeping others at a distance and keeping you from risking something new. But intelligent people begin to notice the cost, the way they filter opportunities through old pain, the way they shrink before growth because they don't know who they'd be without their wound. So they do something quietly revolutionary. They stop telling the same stories. They stop announcing their limitations. They pause before repeating old labels. And instead of saying, "That's just me," they whisper, "Maybe that was me, but it doesn't have to be forever." This isn't about pretending. It's about choosing. It's not about denying the past. It's about refusing to drag it unconsciously into every room you enter. It's about updating the internal script to match the person you're becoming, not the person you were forced to be in survival. Because identity is not a sentence, it's a process. And intelligence is not how well you explain your past, it's how honestly you challenge it. So the next time you feel yourself narrating your limits, pause. Ask, am I saying this because it's true or because it's familiar? And if the answer feels like a habit, let it go. You don't owe your past an eternal allegiance. You owe your future a better author. In a world that rewards visibility, there's a quiet pressure to be everywhere at once, to answer every message, join every call, post every thought, attend every event. And for the intelligent person, especially one who values connection, relevance, or responsibility, this pressure doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like purpose, like momentum, like being in the loop. But eventually something starts to crack. You're in 10 places but not present in any. You're responsive but not real. You're active but absent. And that's when you discover the eighth trap, the need to be everywhere. At first, it looks like engagement. You're being a good friend, a good professional, a reliable partner. But over time, your life starts to feel like a group chat you can't leave. Always buzzing, always open, always demanding your next slice of attention. What you don't realize until it's too late is that presence without boundaries becomes performance. You're no longer showing up because you're aligned. You're showing up because you're expected. This is the curse of intelligent availability. You understand people. You read needs before they're spoken. You feel guilty when you don't respond. So you do, over and over again, until your time is no longer your own, until silence feels selfish, until rest feels like rebellion. The Stoics had no smartphones, but they understood this trap deeply. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul." But if your soul has no schedule, no filter, no sanctuary, it becomes a hallway. Everyone walks through. Few leave anything of value behind. I once worked with someone who was always available. You could call her at midnight, ask for help on a Sunday, or pull her into last-minute chaos, and she'd show up. Every time. Until one day she burned out. Not because she lacked energy, but because she lacked a door. She never closed, never paused, never chose. And that's the shift intelligent people begin to make. They stop mistaking responsiveness for responsibility. They realize that not every ping is a priority, not every presence is necessary, and not every good opportunity deserves their bandwidth. Psychologically, the urge to be everywhere comes from a mix of fear and conditioning. Fear of missing out, fear of being forgotten, fear that if you're not seen, you won't matter. But the deeper truth is this: your value is not in your availability, it's in your intentionality. So intelligent people learn to disappear, strategically, not as an act of retreat, but as an act of refinement. They miss some calls, they ignore some messages, they skip some rooms, and in doing so, they return to themselves. Because you don't need to be everywhere to matter. You need to be somewhere that matters to you. That's not absence. That's alignment. There's a kind of emotional gambling that happens in silence. You don't call it that, of course. You call it hope. You send a message and wait for a reply. You open up and wait for them to care. You show loyalty and wait for it to be returned. But underneath that wait is something far more dangerous. You've placed your piece on the roulette table of someone else's consistency. And this is the ninth trap intelligent people must learn to escape: the emotional casino. It doesn't begin with drama, it begins with depth. You feel things strongly. You read energy. You sense when something's off. So naturally, when you give fully. You don't just speak, you reveal. You don't just share, you invest. And unconsciously, you start expecting emotional returns. Not because you're manipulative, but because you believe in fairness, in reciprocity, in unspoken understanding. But here's the trap. You're betting on clarity from someone who benefits from your confusion. This is where intelligent people get caught. Not in toxic chaos, but in subtle inconsistency. The delayed replies, the mixed signals, the hot and cold energy. And instead of stepping back, they lean in. Because smart minds want answers, closure, logic. They want to fix the ambiguity. So they keep playing, waiting, hoping, refreshing, repeating. But the Stoics offer a different game. Epictetus wrote, "If someone succeeds in provoking you, realize that your mind is complicit in the provocation." Translation: you gave them the dice. You sat at the table. You decided their behavior was the dealer of your peace. That's not love. That's emotional gambling. I once knew someone who said, "I don't think I was waiting for him to choose me. I was waiting for him to make me feel chosen." That distinction hit me hard because it reveals the invisible contract. You hand someone your sense of worth and hope they'll protect it. But intelligent people, especially those who've been burned by ambiguity, start doing something wiser. They stop placing bets. They stop handing over their emotional center like it's negotiable. They start observing instead of investing. Psychologically, emotional gambling stems from unresolved attachment patterns. The idea that love must feel uncertain to feel real, that intensity equals intimacy, that pain means passion. But those are outdated scripts, and intelligent people begin rewriting them, quietly, without announcement, without playing the game one last time for closure. They begin measuring people not by words but by consistency, not by potential but by presence. They ask better questions, not do they care about me, but do they have the capacity to hold what I offer? And when the answer is unclear, they don't chase it, they accept it, because emotional clarity isn't a gift they're waiting for, it's a boundary they create. So they fold their cards, walk away from the emotional roulette, and choose peace, not as a second option, but as the prize. Because when you stop betting on others to regulate your worth, you finally start protecting it. And that's not detachment, that's sovereignty. Sometimes the hardest thing to walk away from is not a person, but the question they left behind. Why did they do that? What changed? Did it ever mean anything? These aren't just curiosities. They become obsessions. They loop in your mind like unsaved files, demanding answers, demanding closure. And so, without realizing it, you enter the 10th trap, chasing closure from chaos. This trap is particularly dangerous for intelligent people. Why? Because you believe in patterns. You trust in logic. You want things to make sense. So when someone exits your life suddenly or leaves you with half-truths and emotional static, your instinct is to decode it. You read the last message again, rewind the conversation, reinterpret the silence, and none of it brings peace. Because here's the truth. Closure is rarely given, especially by the ones who broke clarity in the first place. You think you're seeking resolution, but what you're really doing is handing the author of your confusion the pen, hoping they'll write you the ending you deserve. But they won't, not because they're cruel, but because they're incomplete. Some people don't have the language to explain what they did. Some people don't want to, and others benefit from the fact that you're still spinning, that you're still chasing what they refused to give clearly when they had the chance. The Stoics had no term for closure, but they understood its futility. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." In modern terms, peace is your responsibility, clarity is your creation, and chasing it from someone who thrives in ambiguity is like asking fire to stop being hot. I once watched someone spend months trying to get one final conversation with a person who ghosted them. Not out of desperation, but out of principle. "I just need to understand," they said. But what they didn't see was that their pursuit had turned into submission. They weren't seeking truth anymore. They were seeking relief from uncertainty. But uncertainty, when fed, becomes chaos. Psychologically, this trap often emerges from unresolved wounds, from early lessons that said, if you're confused, it must be your fault. So we chase closure as a way to redeem our confusion. But intelligent people, especially those who've exhausted themselves in emotional waiting rooms, begin to unlearn this. They stop asking why and start asking what now. They realize that clarity doesn't always come from answers. It comes from decisions. That peace isn't the product of understanding. It's the result of choosing to stop participating in what hurts. So they close the loop themselves. They stop rereading the messages. They stop checking for signs. They stop performing stability in hopes someone will mirror it back. And instead, they create distance. Not out of bitterness, but out of wisdom. Because some endings are not delivered, they're declared. And some peace doesn't arrive. You claim it. That's not avoidance, that's liberation. So here we are, 10 traps, 10 invisible patterns, 10 subtle contracts that intelligent people often sign without ever realizing they did. And if you've made it this far, maybe you've recognized one, or several. Not with shame, but with clarity. Because the goal of this reflection is not to judge who you've been, but to awaken who you're becoming. The truth is, intelligence alone doesn't protect you. In fact, it can become its own disguise. It can convince you that overthinking is insight, that people-pleasing is connection, that overexplaining is strength, That constant responsiveness is love. But behind all that noise is something simpler, something quieter, a life that no longer needs to be performed to feel real. The Stoics didn't teach us how to win every battle. They taught us how to walk away from battles that don't matter. They taught us that silence can be power, that stillness can be strategy, that letting go isn't a loss, it's an alignment. Maybe for you, the traps weren't loud. Maybe they showed up in the form of constant self-narration, or the need to reply to every notification, or the desire to fix people who never asked to be healed. Maybe the weight wasn't in what others expected of you, but in what you unconsciously expected of yourself, to be the strong one, the reliable one, the insightful one. But today something shifts, not with fanfare, not with explosion, but with gentle, deliberate refusal, a choice to pause before responding, to observe instead of absorbing, to reclaim the space between what triggers you and what guides you. Because intelligence without discernment becomes exhaustion. But intelligence with restraint, that becomes clarity, that becomes sovereignty. You don't need to escape the world to find peace. You just need to escape the patterns that keep you reacting to it, the traps that taught you to be everything for everyone except yourself, the games that made your value conditional on your availability, the roles you were never meant to play, but performed anyway, just to feel worthy. So take a deep breath, not as a break, but as a boundary, not as a pause, but as a declaration. This is where the loops end. This is where you stop waiting for closure and start creating distance. This is where you stop overexplaining and start inhabiting your truth. Because the most intelligent people I've ever known weren't the loudest or the most impressive. They were the ones who learned how to leave. Calmly, quietly, without burning bridges, but without rebuilding them for those who never crossed halfway. And maybe you're here now, not because you're broken, but because you're finally done performing the version of yourself that kept everyone else comfortable. So go, gently, not to prove anything, but to protect what no longer needs to be explained. And if you ever wonder who you are without the trap, remember, you were never the trap. You were always the key. If any part of this spoke to you, not as content, but as clarity, leave a quiet sign below. Just comment, I choose clarity. No need for paragraphs, no explanation required. Just that simple phrase if you're ready to escape the traps you didn't even know you'd been living inside. And if someone comes to mind, a friend who's always overthinking, always giving, always holding more than they should, send them this video, not as advice, not to say, watch this, but simply as a quiet offering, an invitation to breathe again. If you found something valuable here, something that slowed your thoughts or made you feel less alone, click like or share it forward. You never know who's one conversation away from choosing themselves again. And if this kind of reflection speaks to you, there's more. This video is part of a larger series, a playlist called Wisdom Without Noise. In it, we explore what intelligent people let go of, the boundaries they build, and the reasons they stop apologizing for their clarity. Each one is a mirror. Each one is a doorway back to self. In the next video, we'll talk about the conversations intelligent people avoid, not just to live wisely, but to live lightly, because sometimes walking away from the wrong words is the first step to protecting your peace. So if you haven't already, subscribe and join us. Not for hype, not for noise, but for the moments you need a different kind of voice, one that speaks softly but leaves something strong behind. Until then, protect your peace, choose your energy, and most of all, walk quietly but without apology.